My name is Kerry Roberts, and I am from Mississippi, southern Mississippi to be precise.
I am born and raised in Virginia. I was actually born in Manassas, Virginia, but my family comes from southern Virginia. Manassas, Virginia is in northern Virginia.
I am Michael Davis, and I am from Central Arkansas.
My name is Robert Ritchie. I'm from actually Richmond, Virginia.
Well, the Civil War in Mississippi is viewed perhaps very differently than it is in other parts of the country. In 1860, the state of Mississippi was the wealthiest state in the Union. Shortly after the war, it became the poorest state in the Union and remained there throughout much of the 20th century. And so the war carried a very heavy memory in that state, and it affected the state in a variety of ways. For example, Vicksburg, which is one of the main battles that really ended the Western theater of operations, occurred in Mississippi. Vicksburg fell on the 4th of July, 1863. From that point forward, Mississippians ceased celebrating the 4th of July. Even when I was growing up, there was not much of a holiday there. It was, we eventually saw it as an excuse to shoot fireworks and eat food, so that was pretty good. But there are no parades, there are no lavish patriotic celebrations up until fairly recently.
The first Battle of Manassas was the first major battle of the Civil War, so that's important. But my family comes from southern Virginia, near and around Danville, and that's significant as well because Danville was the last capital of the Confederacy. When Richmond burned and was taken by the Union forces in early April of 1865, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Southern Confederacy, and his cabinet moved from Richmond and escaped and fled to Danville, Virginia, where for 1 week at Major Sutherland's mansion at one of the High Point Bluffs in the city of Danville, that's where they were headquartered until Lee surrendered. And they still fly the flag. To this day, there's a big dispute going on. In that highest point of the city, they're still flying the Confederate flag there above this big monument that was put up about 20-some years ago. And there are some groups trying to have that flag taken down, but the people in the area are very traditionally minded, and so they're fighting to keep it up. They're very proud of the fact that Danville was the last capital of the Confederacy.
The Civil War was an important event in Arkansas. The Western Theater was especially important in the war. In fact, the Western Theater is where the war was really won. Arkansas was a deeply divided state during the Civil War. A lot of that has to do with the geography. Some of the geography of Arkansas is very flat. And so eastern Arkansas is an area where you have a lot of cotton, soybeans today, and that kind of agriculture. Up in the Ozark foothills, where I'm from, it's much more mountainous. And then the further north and west you go, very mountainous. That means as far as the 1850s and going into 1860, 61, what you have is a state that has in the eastern part slavery, and the north and western part in particular that largely does not. So when the war breaks out in 1861, Arkansas initially is not a part of the Confederacy. It is going to be one of the so-called border states. But after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for volunteers, Arkansas will join the Confederacy. And so after the initial secession crisis, I guess is what I should have said, Arkansas had remained on the fence. But after Fort Sumter, it, along with Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, will join the Confederacy. But the state was deeply divided.
Being from the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia, I quickly adapted the prejudices and views of the people there and the culture that I came from. And I remember I was taught very young to be very distrustful of Northerners. They talk fast, they use their hands. You know, strange things like that even this day I have to find myself having to work around. But you know, I do think that perhaps the greatest thing that I learned from the Civil War is that despite the appearance of overwhelming odds, there's always room for hope. And God has a plan, even though we don't know what it might be.
I have a large number of relatives who fought in the war. In fact, all of my male ancestors in that period of time fought at different places and at different times. My great-great-grandfather, Jacob Roberts, was a medic in the 66th Regiment, I think, in Mississippi. He was at the Battle of Shiloh. He was also at the Battle of Antietam. And following those bloody, bloody days, we think he probably decided he'd had enough. We think he probably cut off enough limbs following those battles that he was ready for something else. On my mother's side, my great-great-grandfather, Francis Marion Mahaffey, named after the great South Carolina partisan of the American War of Independence, Francis Marion, he remained in the war throughout its entirety. He was wounded at the Battle of Fall Church in Atlanta late in the war, but he remained in the Army, and he was actually a part of General Richard Taylor's regiment when they surrendered and were demobilized in Centinela, Alabama.
My great-grandfather was born in 1890. His father, my great-great-grandfather, was born in 1872. And he was from Kentucky, which was another divided state. It never joined the Confederacy, but it was very much at odds, Union versus Confederate. And so my great-great-great-grandfather Davis is someone that I don't know. But the rumor is that he was a veteran of the Civil War, but there was no mention of him ever being in the Confederacy. The only hint that I have that he may have fought actually for the Union is that his grandson, who was my great-grandfather, was a Republican in the South in a time, say, the 19-teens and 1920s, which gives an indication that they were probably scallywags, and they were Southerners who were Republicans. And so very likely then that on the Davis side, there was a member of my family who fought for the Union and not the Confederacy.
Having had one great-grandfather who was in the Civil War, he passed down a legacy maybe of stubbornness, but of resolve. And as Christians, we're not instructed to win, we're instructed to stand. And if we can just remain standing a little bit longer, we're doing the Lord's work. So I think there are lessons aplenty from the Civil War, both in my youth and today.
I believe it was just a very defining period in American history. And as long as there are these distinctions, whether it's political reasons, let's set aside a lingering residue of racial problems that are so much better than they used to be. And you just stick to states' rights doctrine still being quite prevalent in these parts, as well as just cultural differences between North and South, and the difference between eating bagels every morning versus grits and bacon and eggs. There's always going to be this regional pride and differences, and I don't know if the Civil War will ever completely die.
So I think we're going to continue to see the Civil War played out, and that shouldn't seem so strange to us. When I was a young man, I made some mistakes, and I did some things well. No matter how I like or dislike that young man now looking back in life, my life is still based on that foundation that I set. And it's, of course, my hope that Americans will set their foundation on stone, which is Jesus Christ, and that a liberty revival of sorts will come from this cultural hearth, and perhaps we'll see the Civil War put to its rightful place as a lesson of the past, but not something that dictates our future.